Hi, and welcome once again to the Mickey Diaries. I'm your host, Mickey. Today I have a story that I'm going to tell you, and it has a title, which is Be Careful of the House You Peek Into. Now, this is an obscure title. Hopefully it will make some sense by the end. It's a title for a story that I'm going to tell from my own childhood. And as I was thinking about putting this story together, it's something that I have thought of from time to time, and I decided to capture it. So I started thinking about the events that would make the story interesting, but I had some difficulty deciding about what year or what age I was, because I didn't keep records back then. But I've settled on the fact that I was probably about 10 years old. And the more I thought about it, the more I think that 10 years old should be the universal standard age to use for anyone telling a story about their childhood, because it's ideal for a true tale. You know, at 10 years old, you're beginning to acquire a sense of your own world and of the world in general. And you're starting to figure out your own family's dynamics, and by then you've probably been inside the homes of other families where maybe you're starting to see that some families are better than the others, and it gives you a chance to compare your own. At 10 years of age, you're probably in the 5th grade, if I figured that out right, providing, of course, you passed the first 4 grades along the way. But if so, you're now reading pretty decently and starting to cipher out numbers pretty good, enough to make change. And you may know some ancillary information like the names of most of the 50 states and maybe the names of the capitals of 2 of them, yours and the one next door. So you're certainly on your way to no longer being a dullard. And at 10 years of age, you are no longer a toddler either. You're not yet scarred or scared by those strange, odd stirrings that are going to happen both inside and outside of you because of puberty. All is still bare down there. Also, at 10 years of age, you can be well out of sight of your parents or be well out of sight of any adult for a while without causing great alarm in anybody. That's a bit of freedom. And at 10 years of age, you're well on your way to knowing the basic difference between right and wrong. And this is not so much a character issue at this point, but if you know what most adults view is right or wrong, you have a pretty good chance of staying on their good side. Mostly. At 10 years of age, you are able to now form your own opinions, which will be replaced by other opinions many, many times for the rest of your life. But you're there now. And you most likely have a core set of friends, be they at school or up and down your neighborhood street. And with good fortune, you have a best friend with whom you spend hours trying to fathom and discern the many perplexities you're now starting to observe in others. And finally, when you are 10 years old, you can roam around at will by yourself and explore the landscape of the physical world that you live in. You now have a curiosity, which hopefully you will never lose, though some sadly do. So after thinking about all of this when I was trying to figure out what age was I think being 10 years old is probably just fantastic. And if for some reason we were able to pick out an age and stay frozen at it, I think I would let most of you all be the adults and I would stay at 10 years old. I mean, lots of upside there, little downside. So that's the age that I'm going to be when I tell you this story. And the story begins in my neighborhood. I grew up in Morning View, which was one of the first of its kind suburbs, this new thing across the land called suburbs. And Morning View was located in Overland Park, Kansas, which was still mostly rural when we moved there. For example, it only took about 10 minutes to go from my front yard into a farmer's field or find a creek or a pond loaded with tadpoles, sometimes crawdads. But if you came back, all of the houses were brand new. So it was this grand experiment. But I remember it was an idyllic time and an idyllic place to grow up. I don't recall there being a lot of ill winds blowing across the land, at least that we knew about as kids. Maybe my folks did. Morning View was a goodly place for everyone. It was good for moms and good for dads, and good for neighbors, and good for kids, and even good for cats and dogs. Everyone just seemed to get along, even the cats and dogs. It was a pretty relaxed living time. For example, you could walk up and down our street at night in the summertime and see that half of the front doors was wide open, with the only security being a latched screen door, even if the household was fast asleep. In the summertime, unlike today, garage doors would remain wide open all day. They were raised once in the morning when someone went to work, and then closed once again at night before bedtime. And if I recall, that was sometimes a child's job. Go out and shut the garage door as the house was being shut down, the lights turned off. The garages then became an extra room in the summertime to play in, which we did. I don't think anyone in Morning View owned a dog leash. Dogs just kind of hung around with the kids, keeping a custodial eye on things. Everyone's backyard was similarly outfitted with a swing set or a jungle gym, and usually a sandbox of various design. Seemed like the fathers all competed for unique sandbox design. Almost always a patio with patio furniture, and a picnic table, which was used a lot to eat outside in the evening. I know we loved it. And then there was usually a garden, which they were always full of tomato plants. Everybody had tomato plants and traded tomatoes. Here's some tomatoes for you. Thanks. Here's some back. So from one end to the other end, the backyards collectively became this one long grassy playground for us. And most of the year, but especially in the summer, the kids were always outside roaming up and down the street, either in the front on the street side or in the back of our houses in the neighborhood. Both sides offer a different form of play. And although the phrase, "it takes a village to raise a child," was prominently coined after I was an adult by Hillary Clinton in her 1996 book of the same name, this was really true of Morning View, too. The mothers were all home every day, and they kept an equal eye out for everyone else's kids plus their own. You could go to any house, knock on the door, and get a glass of water, although we often just turned on the spigot and drank from the garden hose. That was an acquired taste, garden hose water. But it was widely available before we ever heard of Evian water. And if you had a fresh cut or a fresh scrape, the closest mom within earshot of the accident usually appeared with some kind of first aid. And get this, any mom could verbally discipline or even spank, hands-on spank, any child without consequences from the child's mom. That was the takes a village rule. And I probably was spanked or dressed down by most of them at one time or another, but not a big deal. So with that backdrop, on to my personal story here. One day I found myself roaming the neighborhood alone. I had probably been in a couple of open garages already, quietly examining possessions stored therein. It was okay to trespass into open garages, but there were a few things that you shouldn't do if you were unattended. You could certainly look around, but I found it more tempting to rummage through the surplus wares I found out there. Once valuable items that had since lost their sheen to the family and were now relegated to a just in case we need it someday spot on the shelf. Always interesting stuff. But after practicing some garage anthropology, I began wandering aimlessly around other places in the neighborhood, kind of like a lost caribou, long separated from the herd. I may have been carrying a companion stick, a noisemaker stick, to scrape along a chain-link fence or to tap on any hard surface that would make a noise, such as a metal slide on a swing set or ideally the lid of a barbecue grill. I may have already visited a swing set or two, or dabbled in someone's sandbox. And there were always balls and idled toys laying around in the yards, but they were of no interest to me this day. There were no kids outside this day, which was sometimes the case. And I suppose that if another kid were to appear, well, that would have been just fine. But I didn't feel like going up to a door to coax anyone to come out and play. My mood was boredom. And yet I didn't do much about it either. I was definitely a victim of a summer childhood malady called the blahs. And it was, after all, right in the middle of the dog days of summer. Boredom usually marked the halfway point between school ending in the spring and school starting up again in the fall. So I think it was in this listless state of tedium that I was about to have one of those life lessons that I talked about that will stay with you forever. Although now in hindsight, the manner in which I was about to learn this lesson was to be more sensational than the relevance of the lesson itself, which is sometimes the case if you are indeed going to remember the lesson forever, which I can tell you I have. So in my travels, I crossed over several backyard property boundaries into a yard that I had been in hundreds of times. I knew it really well. Some yards, like this one, were probably considered destination yards because the kids hung out more in them than they did in the other yards. Some yards had it and some yards didn't. And today this one was empty, really quiet, offering up really nothing new for me to do. But I was there, and I meandered over to the shade of a tree that was pretty well established in the center of the yard, and it was there that I saw it for the very first time. Laying on the ground at the base of this tree was a birdhouse. Now this birdhouse was old and weathered. It had never been painted, so it was bare wood, now faded out to a satiny silver finish, and it had slightly pulled into itself, shrinking just a bit as it had dry-aged. It looked like it had been in place there on the ground for a very long time, and yet I could not recall ever seeing it before. I quickly did a scan of the rest of the yard, taking a visual inventory of things, and yes, I had seen everything in the yard many times before, but not this birdhouse. Where did it come from? I wondered. I took a gaze up into the canopy of the tree and wondered, could it have fallen from a branch above? Maybe. But it didn't matter because it was fresh to me now, just what a spiritless boy needed to quell these summertime doldrums. So I dropped my companion stick, and I bent over and picked up the birdhouse from the ground. It was moderate in size, kind of like holding a football by its sides. That little perch peg was still attached just beneath the entrance to the birdhouse, which was just a round hole cut into the front. It had roof slats that were joined at the crest and angled down, cascading beyond the two side walls, offering a little extra protection from precipitation. And to my keen eye, it appeared well made at one time, and I deemed it, all in all, a pretty cool little birdhouse. But putting elements of design aside, what really calls out and arouses the curiosity of a bored 10-year-old boy who had just discovered a birdhouse? Well, that would be the answer to this question. Has there ever been any birds in the birdhouse? Was there a nest inside? Well, I intended to learn all about any past aviary colonist that may have visited. I began to raise the house and its darkened front opening to my face to have a good look, a good peek inside the house. But somewhere along the glide path upward toward my face, I felt the birdhouse begin to twitch in my hands, and then it vibrated. accompanied by a really strange sound coming from the inside, and I immediately reckoned that this sound could not be a good thing. The birdhouse was coming alive, and I didn't feel good about it, just like detecting the very early slight tremors of an earthquake. I reflexively put on the brakes and started to pull the birdhouse back away from my face, but not in time before learning with certainty that there was indeed a nest inside the birdhouse. But it was not a bird's nest. It was a wasp's nest. Bzzz, bzzz. "Oh, shit," I said. And yes, we did say "oh, shit" when we were 10 years old. Just ask Ralphie in the Christmas Story. Oh, shit. Now, that vibration and that sound was created by 20 or 30 fighter pilots scrambling to get into the air to launch a counterattack to defend Wasp Nation. Things now appeared to shift into slow motion as I recall these angry, lean, scrappy, venom-filled flying retaliators jousting and contesting with one another at the constricted opening of the birdhouse, vying to be the first to plant a stinger on my face. The confusion and chaos at the doorway did not take long to sort out, though, because out is where they quickly came. Bam! They planted stingers on my cheeks. Bam! They planted stingers on my forehead. Bam! They planted stingers around my mouth and lips. And as my face became too congested, well, my bare arms would also do quite nicely. And my shirt, too. Some of the stingers actually made it through my shirt, a little like tank-piercing armaments that we probably maintain in our own military somewhere. I instinctively threw the birdhouse to the ground while stumbling backwards, trying to cover my face and keep my balance. I put forth a startling human scream, a sound both milk and blood-curdling. I turned and took a blind run in the general direction of the street, passing between two houses and veering sharply left at the first corner I came to. Meanwhile, the fighter pilot wasps followed me for a short distance, planting one or two more Sidewinder missiles into me directly. I didn't really know how many more I got, because I had enough poison in me now to stop knowing anything except run. And I did. I flailed and screeched past two more houses on the way down to my own house, and I was loud enough to bring the village moms to their screen doors, where, in their own mysterious maternal ways, seemed to know that I was a victim of a wasp attack. Why do I know that? Well, I'll tell you. First, my own mom greeted me at our screen door and did a quick triage assessment of my puckering, welted-up face, and immediately planted me in a kitchen chair. I was weeping and wailing, the kind of jagged cry where you grasp for big lungs full of air between sobs. My mom soon returned with some cotton balls, rubbing alcohol, and tweezers. Now, my mom was a professional nurse before my dad made her into a wife. Job one was to pull out the stingers that had detached from the kamikaze Avengers, who I hoped were now dead, according to common stinger lore. And then she would dab me with the alcohol where a stinger had just been to wipe away any surplus venom. But the alcohol made its own kind of sting alongside the sting of venom, and I was not so sure anymore my mom was doing me any good. I thought the point of this was to stop the pain, not make more. Meanwhile, other moms from up the street began arriving, walking right into our house, which was the village way back then, each bringing with them their own witch doctor curative remedy for bee and wasp stings. They made compresses and poultices out of common organic materials found in their own houses, and they gathered around me and in unison began applying rustic medicines all over my face. dampened, moist cigarette tobacco, dabs of softened butter, tiny dollops of mayonnaise, clumps of moistened salt. I was becoming a human condiment tray sporting an array of homespun potions, which had been secretly passed down from mom to mom for an eternity. Only my own mom, the nurse, seemed to be of the 20th century at this moment. The rest could have been midwives straight out of the Dark Ages. Pretty soon I started thinking that maybe these potions were working, as eventually my sobs did die down, commensurate with the venom now losing some of its vinegar and punch. And the attention I was receiving from the handmaidens also contributed to some pain relief. I had not been the center of anything for quite some time. I began to settle and breathe a little more normal. My chest stopped heaving. And pretty soon, one by one, the moms turned their attention onto other momly things, since it was obvious I was going to live. And they were now gathered together in a kitchen, our kitchen, and could have a good old-fashioned clatch. Who wants coffee? And me? Now seemingly ignored, I did get up and go look in the mirror at my organically painted face. It was pretty cool. Just think of Mel Gibson in Braveheart. I hoped these puffy welts would remain until the next day, when the kids, who I'm pretty sure would hear about this tonight, would come outside to examine them up close tomorrow. Now in hindsight, and as I said at the beginning of this story, a lesson was surely learned. I can say with aplomb that I have never ever gazed into the opening of a birdhouse again. But I do wonder, though, if I could have just read this advice in a book. Nah. This has been the Mickey Diaries, and if you're still here with us, well, thanks a lot for listening. I'll see you next time. Out.